Stevens, for those of you who don't know me already, and I'm the moderator and host for the Racial Healing, Justice, and Unity Bahá'í-Inspired series. So we're just delighted to have you here. Just a little overview for those who might be joining, why we're here. Hopefully the title says a lot. We're very interested in the issue of racial healing and justice and how we can get to unity. That's not sameness, but it's unity and diversity. How can we as a society, as neighborhoods, as communities, as families, how can we move in that direction for a society that values diversity and welcomes it and flourishes with it. So that's the overall thrust of the commonality, if you will, I think, for all of us that are here in the room. So I just want to share with you some of our objectives, what we hope to accomplish in this space. It's to have honest and truthful discourse about current causes and conditions, and understanding in particular the deeply entrenched notions of anti-Blackness that pervade our society, to examine what's being done, what truly makes a difference, and why, to build cooperative and collaborative relations with each other, and to elevate our knowledge, to ignite our volition, and then to take action, whatever that action may be for you as an individual. So again, welcome everyone. We're delighted you're here. We're going to go ahead now and start our brief devotional program. And Jillian, if we could have, we'll start with a drum, and then we have a reader who will read a couple of things with some music interspersed. And then we will move into the formal program and announce or introduce our presenter and go from there. So thank you, friends. Jen, are you with us?
I am. Let's see.
Can you see the slide?
I can. Okay. Oh, people of justice, be as brilliant as the light and as splendid as the fire that blazed in the burning bush. The brightness of the fire of your love will no doubt fuse and unify the contending peoples and kindreds of the earth, whilst the fiercest of the flame of enmity and hatred cannot but result in strife and ruin. We beseech God that he may shield his creatures from the evil designs of his enemies. He verily hath power over all things. Baha'u'llah, Gleanings.
Hello, friends. This is Milton Booby Conway, and I'll be reciting the Hollow Reed prayer with the chant. Here goes. Oh God, make me a hollow reed, from which the pith of self hath been blown, that I may become a clear channel through which thy love may flow to others. I had left behind me impatience and discontent. I will chafe no more at my lot. I commit myself wholly into thy hands, for thou art my guide in the desert, the teacher of my ignorance, the physician of my sickness. I am a soldier in my king's army. I have given up my will to him, and my life to dispose of as he may please. I know not what fate deigns me, nor will inquire to seek to know. The task of the day suffices for me, and all the future is thine. Thou changest weakness to strength, doubt to faith, perplexity to understanding. When I am fit to bear the burden, thou wilt lay it on my shoulders. When I am prepared to take the field, thou wilt assign me a place in the army of light. Now I have no other duty than to equip myself for thy service. With eagerness and patience, with hope and gratitude, I bend to the task of the hour, lest when thy call comes, I be found unready. O God, make me a hollow reed, from which the pith of self hath been blown, that I may become a cleared channel through which thy love may flow to others.
Say, O my God, attire mine head with the crown of justice, and my temple with the ornament of equity. Thou verily art the possessor of all gifts and bounties. I beseech thee, by thy cause that hath encompassed the world of being, and by thy name wherewith thou hast subjected the seen and unseen, to adorn the peoples of the earth with the light of thy justice, and to illuminate their hearts with the brightness of thy knowledge. Baha'u'llah.
Friends, during this time, we'd like to take a moment in each of our devotional spaces here to invite you to call to mind friends, loved ones, ancestors of blood and or spirit, and invite you to put their names in the chat. So we might take a moment to pray for them as they are able to pray for us. And also to bear in mind the many lives that are being lost in Ukraine, as well as many other parts of the world, in conflicts which are not as readily publicized, but are still ongoing. And for those who have been trampled under the wheel of injustice. So if you have someone you'd like to add into the chat, please do so. Or just call them to mind, whatever you're comfortable with. And then we will continue. Could I have the next slide, please, Jillian? And while you're doing that, these are some notable Baha'is who have passed on, but who stood for racial justice, and a wide variety of people. And so we like to just invite them as well to join us, and these are just a few. So Jillian, if we could have the next slide, please. And we'll have a little music.
ای طالب ملکوت به الطاف حضرت پروردگار امیدوار باش و از مصائب شدیده این جهان نامید مگرد. الحمدلله خدای مهربان داری که طبیب هر بیمار است و غمخوار هر مبتلا، پناه یتیمان است و معین بی کسان و بی نهایت مهربان. اگر بدانی که قلب عبدالبها چقدر مهربان است، البته از شدت فرح و سرور پرواز نمایی و فریاد وا توبا به اوج آسمان رسانی. والبها علیک
Another thing that we'd like to do is to invite you to identify, if you wish, the indigenous territory on which you're living. And if you haven't done this before, there's a phone number in there. You can just text your zip code and it will tell you what Indian or Native American tribes originally held the land on which you were living and breathing. And we do this as an acknowledgement to our indigenous brothers and sisters who have held this continent for millennium and who continue to try to be good stewards, who are good stewards, but who try to steward, our resources and the use of this land and its sacredness. So we like to remember them. They're often the forgotten minority. And so this is our opportunity just to let them know that we have not forgotten them. And so again, we'll have a little music if you'd like to put that in there. And if you could indicate the city or town that you're in, that's really interesting for us looking at the chat, because then we can associate the indigenous territory with the location. It's not required. So we'll have a little music to go with this. And then from there, we are going to proceed into our program. So enjoy the music and find that territory. Okay, thank you very much, friends. All right, well, where's Justice? Let's get Justice up here.
This is Carol on the phone, and I'm in the Nupsac and Lummi Indigenous region.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Because I can't put anything in your chat, because I'm on the phone.
That's right, that's right. Thank you for speaking up and sharing that with us. We really appreciate that. Thank you. All right, well, we're finally at our presenter, and we're delighted to welcome back Justice Castaneda. And let me tell you a little bit about Justice, if you didn't have a chance to read his fascinating and lengthy bio, and I'm sure there's a lot he didn't put in there too. He's been a very busy man, and I jokingly, but in some seriousness too, say that you know, Justice, his mom really burdened him with a very powerful name, and I think his life, the things that he's been working on and doing, have all been about justice and trying to achieve justice. And so we're really delighted to have you here. And this program was put together, you know, the quotations about justice with you in mind, you know, in honor of you and your efforts in the community. So let me go ahead and share a bit. I'm going to try not to read it, but he just has such a fascinating background. He's a native Madisonian. Can you believe that? Hey, Jean, right? And when he left here, he was in the Marine Corps for 8 years, honorably discharged, of course. And then he went on to earn a Master's of Arts in Policy, Organization, and Leadership Studies from the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. Then he earned his Master's of City Planning from MIT, where he focused on housing policy, community, and economic development, before accepting a fellowship with the Center for Health and Communities at the University of California, San Francisco Medical Campus. And he is currently completing his dissertation, his doctoral degree, here at UW-Madison in the Department of Regional Planning. He is an educator and community development specialist by trade. His professional and academic work explores the intersections of housing policy, economic development, and community violence, looking at the role these intersections play in educational and life outcomes, especially for youth who have experienced traumatic events in early childhood and adolescence. His most recent research explores the relationship between land use policies, including housing policy, and economic educational outcomes for youth in Madison, Wisconsin. He's also served on the Ad-Hoc Committee on Educational Resource Officers for the Madison Metropolitan School District from 2017 to 2019. And he was also appointed to the Task Force on Government Structure for the City of Madison from 2018 to 2019. So with no further ado, please welcome Justice Castaneda. Thank you, Justice. And the chat is now closed. You can reach us if you need anything, and we'll open it up later on when we get to Q&A.
Okay, great. First, I just want to say thank you all for the opportunity to be here with you to talk about this today. I'm going to get into this. I'm going to say in advance, I just got over, I'm from Wisconsin. It also, I swear, is trying to, I'm also allergic to it. No, in the spring, since I was a kid, and I feel like as I get older, it gets worse every year. I get what I feel like is like an allergy bomb that just gets dropped in my head. And I'm just kind of at the very tail end of it. So I'm going to try to get through this thing without going into a crazy coffee fit. But I may have to pause it just to drink some water. So I do apologize in advance. I know we just shut the chat down. Something that I would be curious to hear from or to kind of get a sense of is where are folks from, the range of, I see a number of, I've seen a few of the folks who have said where they're from, but I just kind of, I know I presented so I guess the two questions, just to get a sense of how many folks were with us the last time we went through some of this. And then the other question is kind of the range of where people are from, just so I can get some degree of orientation as to how I can best frame this, if that makes sense. Okay. But yeah, if it's possible to do that, that would be great.
We can do that, Justice. So folks, I'm going to ask you to use your participant hands, in the Zoom thing. So for those of you that were here when Justice did his first presentation, if you'd raise your participant hand and we can get a count on those. So if you were here, this was in July of last year, and it was on redlining. Give you a second there. So just raise your participant hand as if you wanted to speak. Okay, there we go, because I know a number of you were here. Sid, you were here. Sid and Nancy were here, I'm sure. Okay, anyone else? I know it takes a minute sometimes to get those things up and going. Okay, wow, I'm surprised. Okay, all right. And then the second question is, okay, so if you could lower your hands, great, thank you. All right, and then the second question is, let's put it this way. How many of you are from Wisconsin? So if you're in the state of Wisconsin, if you'd raise your participant hand. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Oh, that's helpful. No, that's really helpful. So we got about a third of the group was here for the first time, and then about 5 are in the state of Wisconsin. All right, that's really helpful. I'm gonna, if it's all right, I'm gonna go ahead and. Well, my name is Justice Castaneda. I am the executive director of a little community development organization here in Madison. We do some amazing work. You know, it predates me. It kind of got me back to Madison. I had been just to. Charlotte kind of, you know, through the bio in all those places, Madison became somewhat of a muse of mine, actually, when I was still in the military, in the arts, you know, kind of as a spiritual journey. And I just, you know, kind of talking about this whole thing, you know, without getting too deep, you know, I was a kid with character. You know, I kind of was an angry child. I think I had a lot of things that I had to work out. Was not necessarily an upstanding citizen. And I think ended up in the Marine Corps kind of by the skin of my teeth. I barely made it in. And that was kind of a last ditch effort just to get out of the situation. But while I was there, I kind of discovered certain periods of sobriety for the first time, really in my adolescence, for sure. You know, in late adolescence when I was in the military, and you know, I think through that period, and definitely while I was at war, in the moments that I had for reflection, I thought a lot about who I was, and you know, these kind of existential questions about what are things forward, why are we doing this, and why do I feel this way? And I thought a lot, you know, something, at least for me, when I was deployed, I thought a lot about growing up and the people who were here and my friends and the people I grew up with, some of the folks that, you know, that I had hurt in my life prior to the military, and then maybe a little bit about why I was hurting so much, you know, even in that moment. And it got me to really start thinking about Madison and about, you know, the place that I grew up and the way that I grew up, and what this all kind of meant. And I was able, you know, I'm very fortunate, you know, I was able to come home from the war, and even while I was in the military, I was allowed the space to go to school and to start asking this question in academic spaces about who I was and what was going on and what all this was about. And that kind of led me to some of these questions about Madison, Wisconsin. So as we get into, I'm going to get into this in just a second, but just because we have some time, I do want to talk a little bit about Madison, Wisconsin, and you know, why Madison became a, you know, why I think that it's a good, I would say, not muse per se, but it's a good case study on not just the history of racial segregation, but also the way that the residuals become so baked into contemporary politics that it makes it very difficult, even if everybody knows and everyone's aware that this is our history, it doesn't necessarily mean that we know what exactly we're supposed to do. And in many ways, you know, and I use this very carefully, I would say through a type of absorption or isomorphic behavior, we become part of these same systems that reproduce this, even if our intent is to get into these systems and we get into these practices with the initial goal of dismantling a lot of these systems. And so Madison, Wisconsin, if just for folks, it's a what I call in my academic work, I call it a Charlie Alpha, which means it's a capital city that has a flagship university in it. And there are a few of them. And I think about these things because there's some facts that make them outliers. They tend to be, you know, in terms of economics, they tend to withstand volatility and kind of your global market. So when there's recessions and market volatility, these municipalities and metro areas, when they exist, tend to do a little bit better, just because they have government systems and universities that attract the type of revenue, you know, that attract the type of stability. You know, if you think about them, you're thinking about your Lansings, you're thinking about your Lincolns, your Columbuses, your Tucsons, Salt Lake City to a certain extent. And then in Madison, Wisconsin. Madison, Wisconsin has some of the most pronounced and severe disparities in educational and economic outcomes between our Black residents and their white counterfactual, and in the United States. Wisconsin, for folks that don't know this, is one of the worst, if not the worst state in the United States in terms of the same disparities. As Madison and Milwaukee have that very unfortunate distinction as being both historically horribly segregated, but also having some of these horrible disparities in terms of the outcomes. Some of the things that make Madison unique is that, and again, when people think about this, you know, a lot of times when we talk about this stuff, there's a lot of folks, folks of color, white folks, people who just are historically adept and understand the history of race in the United States. And they're like, yo, I don't remember anywhere really being great historically for Black folks or folks of color in general. So like all that you're saying is like, what, you know, when we talk about these things that make a city or an area the worst or amongst the worst, how are you deciphering it? How are you distinguishing it? And one thing that I'll talk about and I'll get into, and that is kind of an undercurrent in everything I want to present today, is that the moderator, the thing that can explain the disparities in Madison is race alone. It's very true that there are disparities all over the United States, but one of the mitigating factors that you'll see, and again, you'll see this a lot in the South, is income, right? And so if a family, regardless of race, if they have higher levels of income and their parents have high degrees of education and are involved in their children's lives, you'll see that the disparities, they start to shallow a little bit. Whereas in Madison, the thing that explains it is race alone. And what I mean by that is that some of our biggest gaps in educational and economic outcomes are not just between lower income folks and folks with money, and not just between our Black residents, our residents of color and their white color counterfactual. It's actually between white residents, Black residents, Black children who have parents with high incomes, parents who have high educational levels, and parents, and this is an index, but parents who have high degrees of involvement in their children's lives and their white counterfactual. And so what that's saying is that even in Madison, when you have a family, folks of color who have high education, high income, and high degrees of involvement in their children's lives, the gap between them and their white counterfactual is the largest of all the gaps. And so what that's saying is that those things are not serving as the mitigating factor that they do in other places. Another thing that came out, and as I'm talking about this kind of as the preamble as we get into the housing, about Madison, and the school district actually put this out a few years ago because there was a narrative, and I would argue that a lot of this was your good old-fashioned dog whistle narratives, but the argument was that the issue in Madison in terms of our disparities was that there were people who were coming from Milwaukee, people who were coming from Chicago, and people who were coming from the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul. And that was obfuscating the results. Now, I mean, between all of us, I feel comfortable and confident in saying that most of us understand that what was really happening is as the defense mechanisms for the systems and kind of we'll just say the resistance to making significant inroads and change via policy tools and maneuvering, a lot of the white elected officials, white community leaders instead said that the issue is that we have Black folks coming from other places that are making this place worse. The school district did a study and they found that actually the thing that determined the degree to which a child was at risk of graduating high school actually had to do with how long they were in the Madison School District. So if you had a child who came here from Chicago or Milwaukee or Minneapolis, and they came here, let's say as a 7th grader, they had a higher chance of graduating than someone who was in Madison schools since they were a 6th grader or before they got here. So the issue again was something that was endemic to the Madison landscape. It wasn't something that we were importing on that level. So I wanted to put that just out there as some context. Madison became that muse for me. It became something that in every place when I was in education, I started thinking about this because the first place that you see a lot of these gaps are in, we hear about them, the achievement gap or the achievement gaps. I learned through my studies in education to think about these things, and education is kind of your proverbial canary, right? Like what we see in our schools rarely originates in our schools. A lot of times it's stuff that's happening outside of our schools, and that our teachers, our educators, the people who go in there are asked to do, they are asked to be the mitigating factor in all these other areas where we have shortchanged our I don't know how to make the, excuse me, I'm having. I forgot to. All right, sorry about that. I forgot to shut off my phone on my computer at work. So I was getting a phone call and I couldn't stop it from my headphones. So I started thinking about that and what I actually, and this is at the time when I was in graduate school for education, like a lot of graduate students, you find something that actually, people have been writing about for decades. But when you figure it out, it becomes like you've invented something or you discovered the light bulb. But the thing that I'm referring to was that a lot of the things that actually are going to be the underpinnings of academic and economic success actually they start in terms of our economy, right, and our community and all these other things. And this is kind of how I ended up at housing. So I'm going to share now. This brings us to today's presentation. So I call this the housing mixtape because as I kind of alluded to, a lot of the conversation around redlining, restrictive covenants is I would say for good reason, it's becoming more and more I would say, in vogue. It's more and more common and casual for people to talk about. I think this is really important. I think there's groups like yours. There's a lot of other political groups. There's a lot of just social advocacy groups, a lot of neighborhood groups, a lot of people who are really looking at this. And also, you know, the rent is too darn high. And people are seeing this housing crunch, something that's happening right now that is unique to what we were seeing in the aughts, is that this kind of rapid increase, this the aggressive increase in housing prices, rental and ownership, is not unique to certain metros like it was in 2006, 2007, 2008. We're seeing this all over. And so something about housing is that there's a lot of things that go into this. There's a lot of things that go into this concept called housing. And there's a lot of things that we think about when we go into this. So in addition to giving an overview and kind of what we're going to do today and how I'm going to kind of frame this, I am going to go through, again, I know that the first presentation I was very heavy on the concepts of redlining and restricted covenants, what they were in a more definitive and rote analysis. And then I kind of, again, I'm going to continue to use Madison as a muse. I do think that Madison, it neatly demonstrates a lot of the residual effects of historic land use practices. And what I mean by neatly is the geography of Madison. There's two lakes. It's on an isthmus. It was built on an isthmus. I'll talk about this in a second. But the peripheralization is very noticeable. And when you see the maps, you'll see what I mean. The same effect happens in a number of metros. I have similar analyses that I've done for San Diego, California, that I've done for Boston, and that I've done for St. Louis, some stuff that I've done around Chicago. It gets laid out differently in those cities, in the way that the cities evolved. And so you still see what I'll call, and I'll refer to later, as the peripheralization effect, but it isn't in the sense of pushing things to the literal periphery of a city like it does in Madison. You can be peripheralized in Boston and still be in the middle of the city. And so that has more of a peripheralized from economic function and practices than it does geographically peripheralized. And again, in the Madison and definitely Milwaukee context, you see this type of hyper-segregation in such a vivid, real, and raw way that it makes it very convenient to kind of show, and that's why I use this. So Madison is an example or a case study as to how I'm gonna show how redlining and restrictive covenants and historic land use practices have been used to operationalize segregation and actually exclude entire, parts of our histories, especially and predominantly for Black African-American residents in the United States from conventional economic and democratic processes. Now, this is about Madison in the sense that that is the focus point. I do encourage you guys to send the moderators questions if there's things that become so Madison specific, or even do the hand raise or something that you can stop me so I can clarify, just so I can bring it back out. I can take it up a couple degrees so that I can bring this out into the general application. That's what the point is. Excuse me. There are many issues that all municipalities are facing, and there's so much of this history that is universal. I've talked about a number of the other cities that I've looked at, and I can kind of do this with there, but Madison is a way to both capture how this is operationalized, how it's happening, but also to give us some sense of how maybe we can tweak some of this and what are some opportunities for us to kind of move forward. I was at Bluff, BLUF is an acronym. It means bottom line up front. I say BLUF. So that's the first one that I'll be. So I should say this is dissertation work, and so this is, you know, hundreds of pages of work that I've tried to throw into different presentations to show different parts of it. This is the second time that I've tried to summarize my dissertation project. It's a long, winding, meandering road. And each of the topics and all of the topics that I'm going to talk about today are dense enough that we could spend this entire time on any one of them. So I'm going to try and attempt to bring it all home in the, you know, the next 30 or so minutes. I will say that just in terms of, you know, kind of a epistemological ambit from which I operate, we all have understandings of certain issues in terms of the way that race has been operationalized, the way it's been constructed. It's, you know, the pernicious history of the United States in terms of its treatment of, in essence, everybody who was not considered white at some point in time, right? And the way that this has particularly affected our indigenous populations, our Black populations, and our communities of color, and then the way that it has been, you know, the intersection between race and gender. And we think about this in terms of how it affects folks who don't identify as cisgendered men and historically white men, the way that that has been operationalized. So again, we all, I think, have an understanding of this stuff, and we develop our policies and interventions accordingly. So I think this is one of the reasons I think that this research and work is so important. I also just want to, again, just to reiterate that, you know, a lot of places are, you know, again, when I kind of was doing some of the first work on just the race component, is to make sure, you know, some of the feedback is to emphasize that I recognize and know that Madison is not the only place that struggles with mitigating or trying to address its history of its treatment of BIPOC populations. We are not. It happens all over the place. It's happening all over. Many of you guys are involved and are active in your own right in the places that you live, with movements that are happening that are addressing a lot of these same things. So I start with that stuff. So I'm from Madison. I talked about this, you know, in some ways there's always a part of this that that kind of inform part of me, that kind of inform how I go about this. I think part of my decision to come home and work in Madison as I finished the dissertation work was really to be able to center myself as someone who's trying to operate in the housing world while I go through this. Because I know another thing that happens as graduate students and even policy folks who are doing more macro policy work is that we can operate at a level where we're not, it's not that we're not grounded, it's that the pressures and the responses that we're having to make are not as local as that when you're home. So, or when you're working in a place and when you're having to respond to the real lives of real folks who are living in your housing, and you're trying to create housing, not like a policy that can create it broadly, but you're saying, I have actual folks who I know and see and can touch and feel and related to in some cases, who are struggling with this. So how, with that pressure, how am I able to operate this stuff? So these are kind of my general research questions and the things that I brought into this. A big part, and I put this up front, why do they persist? Because what I want to do with this and what I'm trying to do with this is to provide it some insight as to, even though you have a lot of very well-intentioned folks, you have a lot of people who are deep into this work, why do these things persist? Sherilyn, you're going to say something?
Oh, yeah. What was LMI on the previous screen? Yeah, LMI and BIPOC. So there's
Okay,
a
you know,
question about
excuse me.
LMI.
LMI, low to moderate income. I do talk about this in a bit, but I should say right off the bat, we here at Commonwealth, in terms of my colleagues and definitely me in terms of the way that I center my work, I do what I call repatriate, or I reclaim the concept of low income. I know that people do everything they can, especially when they're talking about creating housing, to avoid saying that term. They say everything else. They'll say workforce housing, they'll say affordable housing. Affordable housing in many cases, I mean, by definition, HUD, it means someone who is, you know, you're not paying more than 1/3 of your income on housing annually. Why is it 1/3? Because in, you know, circa 1930, it was 25%, and they wanted to change it. So they changed it to 1/3. So there's not, in terms of why that is the threshold. But then from there, what they created are these categories of area median income. And so the way that a lot of the subsidies that are given through HUD, not through HUD, but through the IRS, Section 42, Section 8, these are actually IRS designations. But the way that they look at affordability in an area is by the area median income. And so you'll see housing that they're saying, you know, you're going to create 172 units of affordable housing. What it is saying is that if they're 80% units, that means that an individual in Madison, Wisconsin, and again, this is going to change for all places, you know, in terms of the dollar amounts, but an individual in Madison, Wisconsin can make up to $72,000 and still be considered you know, that's still, they still qualify for affordable housing. What I'm talking about, regardless of the locality, is people who are making in the bottom 3 quintiles of the income distribution. And so when you're talking about folks, and this obviously is, we're talking about folks who work in what I would say the service industries, people who are doing, excuse me, I'm gonna cough. Who are doing service work, but also people who are, a lot of, I would say people who are taking care of your children or people who take care of your parents also fall into these categories. A lot of educators, a lot of social service workers, social workers, a lot of starting teachers, they all fall into these categories. And what we're showing is that a lot of the affordable housing that gets created is still inaccessible to them. Now, the other thing about LMI and the way that we think about it, access to housing, is there are things like screening criteria and other tools that are installed in the housing accession process that make it elusive or inaccessible to people, even if they would otherwise qualify. And so there's a number of things in terms of everything from criminal record to income. So a lot of times, whereas the housing is for a certain threshold of income, but you have to make up to 3 times as much as the rent to get in, because that's in the screening criteria. So there's stuff like that that also obfuscates it. So, you know, when I do it, and we all get this, a lot of the story here is that there is a narrative that low-income folks are bad, right? Because one of the ways that we know that is because we call them poor. I don't, you know, we try not to use that word, poor. I don't think that that's a way to describe someone's income, right? Which is really what we're talking about. It's a quality of the person, right? So it's like poor is not the right. If it's wealthy, then the opposite should be folks who don't have a whole lot of money or people who don't have wealth. I mean, poor people implies there's like a poor quality person. And so there's a lot of these terms. Now, you know, there's a lot of stories that people will say about the projects in different cities. And they say when you concentrate low-income people in one area, you're going to have all these other issues. Well, actually, it had nothing to do with low income. It had everything to do with human beings live in substandard environments, human beings living in housing that was not designed for human beings who had significant needs in terms of their health, living in places that were not healthy, and human beings who needed access to the economy, having to live in housing that completely excluded them from access to the economy. And so it is true that if you take folks who need access to the economy and you put them in places that exclude them, there are a number of other things that will come along with it. So, you know, we you know, it's one of these things that we try to work on. So I'm going to start with just kind of the concept and what we're talking about with redlining and covenants. This is an old Hulk map from Homeowners Loan Corporation. So what they would do with cities is they would break them up. Every city has, you know, most of the cities that are, you know, older than 1950 have these maps. And basically what they would do is they would break up the city in terms of what they saw as being the desirable areas. And then they would say that what would happen is they would not allow, fundamentally, they would not allow, in particular, Black residents. In some places it was Black and your Latinx populations. In some places it was until after World War II, it was Black folks and Jewish folks. There was a number of people who would fall into this. But we'll say Black folks and folks in color, they would not allow them to get loans to buy houses in certain areas, thereby excluding them access to certain areas. And a lot of the same areas, the ones that you see in green and in blue on this map of Madison, you also saw something called restrictive covenants. And I'm going to get into that in just a second. So this talks about this. I mean, these are just some basic things in terms of, you know, how they define this. One of the things that when you were defining the areas, there was a couple things that made the places that folks were allowed to live particularly relevant or pernicious. And some of it had to do with proximity to economy. So I talked about this. If you have a place that you're having to live, but your transit time, but you can't get there on transit, you know, in terms of where you have to work, or there isn't adequate transit, that's one thing. Another thing, and this happened all over the place, there's been some really, really great work done. Laura Polito did an excellent survey of this, of Los Angeles. Natalia Molina did another one of the Chinatowns in Los Angeles. But there's a number of these that have been studies that have been done around the United States on different cities, that where you found folks of color was where they were allowed to live and where they were allowed to buy property, there was a high likelihood that they would be in close proximity to places that were toxic. And by toxic, I mean toxic. So that means places where you have factories, where you had actual radioactive material. I think of Barrio Logan in the shipyards in San Diego, where you had heavy industry. So you had housing that literally was making people sick or compromising people's health. And so there was these things that just the location and just by being excluded from areas of a city, you could in essence affect their health and their wealth in terms of access to the economy. And then the other area is that the housing, as you could imagine, isn't worth as much. Now that matters a lot it's going to be harder to explain in the Madison context to folks who are not familiar with Madison, but we could just say that there's houses that are built, and I'll just kind of click back. This is an old map. These neighborhoods, well, I'll show you in a minute, and you'll see how this has persisted. But in essence, I don't think you can see my cursor, but you can see this little square, correct? Okay, so this area here, sorry, right here, this blue area, let's see if I can do it, right here. When I was doing some initial research here, in this blue area here, again, still desirable. Now it's one of the, it's actually literally where I'm sitting right now. There was a house built the same year as a house that was built right over here off Bell Street on the south side of Madison. This little box down here. The house on the south side was actually a little bit bigger. Same year. Now today, well, today meaning in 2017 when I looked at this, so it's probably not the same today, but I'll just say, well, I think it would be the same today in terms of the difference. But when I looked at this, same house, same everything, there was a $285,000 difference in terms of the value of the house. Now, what was unique is that if you were a Black resident in Madison, you could not be, not just because of the loan restrictions, but because of the actual deed restrictions on the house, you could not buy property where that house was. So now when you think about that, let's say 1.5, 2 generations later, when you think about who has access to the equity that came with that asset, it is totally different. And so you have this thing in terms of, now when you think about, well, what does that mean? Well, if you wanted to get a mortgage on your house and start a business or send a child to college, or you just, when you got into your twilight and your children are grown and you're ready to sell the house and you're going to take that money and that becomes part of your estate, this is how equity, accumulates and how it matters. So this is a story of the history of redlining and covenants. So something about the, hold on. So in 1948, Shelley v. Kramer, the Shelley v. Kramer decision made restrictive practices no longer enforceable, but it wasn't until 1968 that they became illegal. And that's really important because it's one of these things that even now we see this with a lot of housing, that if you don't know the law and someone says that you can't, if you don't know the law, and we're assuming, right, because now they're no longer enforceable in court, that doesn't mean that they were still not used and that they were still not, in essence, aggressively the same effects. Something that in Madison, I've seen this in a couple cities. I actually ran into it in Madison, kind of happenstance, when Commonwealth was looking to do a low-income housing development. But what started happening, and I saw this in Madison, and I've looked and I've seen it in Kansas City now, or sorry, not Kansas City, in St. Louis. But between 1940 and 1970, a lot of folks recognized that these were being challenged in court. So what they started doing is taking the plats that historically had been restricted, they had restrictive covenants based on race, and they started making it restrictive based on the type of housing. And so instead of saying you can't live here because you're Black and putting that into the deed, it said that this house can never be anything other than a detached single-family house. Now that mattered because in terms of where folks could live and how people were going to access these things, that means that you could never have multifamily rentals. And there was another way to, in essence, circumvent the effects of the restrictive covenants that were in place. And, you know, as I put here, to maintain demographic homogeneity after 1948. So this is Madison now. Now, again, you can see from here, if this was the entire city to here, the city's grown. But something you'll see, and this is where our Black folks, so this again is, I have to redo this with the 2020 census. I have not done it yet.
So just to give me my bearings, Justice.
Yeah.
So the dark lavender, that's the Black population, is that right?
Dark lavender, you read this, sorry, this right here?
Okay, that's red, yeah. Is that the Black population?
Yeah, the blue is the lakes.
Oh, okay. And I live here, all right.
Yeah, the blue are the lakes. So the blue are the lakes. The red is where we have concentrations of folks of color, or Black folks.
Okay.
This is the one for Latinx. And what you'll see is that both, if you think about where they are, going back to this, again, the peripheralization effect that I was talking about, when you think about this today and where you have housing and where we have folks of color in Madison, Wisconsin, it's all at the periphery. You will find, if you talk to people who came here for the university, well, they're, you know, living on a campus, it's completely different than if you grew up, like I grew up in a lot of the neighborhoods at the outsides of this, you know, in these periphery neighborhoods. And so the idea of being around or seeing folks of color was not foreign to me until you move downtown. And then all of a sudden you feel it, right? And then it's not just, and as anyone who's ever moved into a place that is overwhelming, who's a person, basically anyone who's ever moved somewhere where everybody all of a sudden no longer looks like you. It doesn't matter really. And all you look around and everybody notices the thing. It is a very noticeable thing. Something that I think is really interesting for folks who grow up here is I don't know that I really realized how odd it was until I left, right? I left Madison for 19 and a half years. So it wasn't really until I left and I went to San Diego and I was in there with everybody who was folks of color. Excuse me, where I realized that like, oh, this is different, right? Like I'm in the store, I'm in here with my tank top because it's hot out and I have tattoos. I could be a judge or whoever. I could be anybody because everybody in here looks just like me. So there isn't a feeling of that, whereas in Madison, it's totally different. So again, the concept of where they're living, it's not just about the geography, but also a type of housing. And this matters a lot in Madison. It's, you know, I think one of the things that's really interesting, Oakland is another city that I've done a lot of work on in terms of the history of housing and land use, definitely Chicago. One thing that's unique is in a lot of those places, even in a lot of your lowest income places, a lot of people live in houses. And there's neighborhoods with housing, right? They're smaller, the bungalow style house. In Madison, it's a lot of rentals and multifamily rentals, and which is kind of different. So I'm going to look at this right now. I'm going to use this concept called NRTs, as neighborhood resource teams, and it's a city designation. It's not uncommon. The first place that started using these was Boston. Mayor Menino used these, but basically it's a way for the city to focus on quote unquote problem areas, problem neighborhoods. This actually, I should move this map, but these are the NRT neighborhoods, right? These are the areas in Madison that the city has designated as being problem neighborhoods or challenged neighborhoods. Now, something you'll see, I mean, this map, again, this is this thing that I was saying about Madison, where it neatly puts things, it neatly paints the picture in the sense that you don't have to be a, demographer to get that these are all at the periphery of the city. Now we go back here to where folks of color are. What you're seeing, again, is that these neighborhoods are out here, out at the periphery. Now, one of the things that I talk about with peripheralization is that it's not just geographically, a lot of it's also politically. That will take another, I'll talk about that in just a second. But one of the other things that I noticed with these neighborhoods in Madison is that there are also places that right now represent some of the highest turnover every year, annually, of any of the entire city. So what do I mean turnover? That means that on an annual basis, the families move. So these neighborhoods, I think I found 7 of them represented over 50% turnover annually. One of the things that I would say is if you are, I always say this, that if I'm a teacher or, and I'm an educator and you show me a school where the children are turning over at a, 50% plus clip annually, the lowest income feeder neighborhoods, children from your lowest income feeder neighborhoods are turning over annually, you will struggle to reach them. You'll struggle to teach them, right? Like that's going to happen. I don't care if you have Yoda in the classroom, you're going to struggle. You're going to have challenges working with them, and they're going to persist. So I use, when we're talking about housing, I use volatility a lot. Now we're kind of transitioning just to put us into this conversation. I moved through the redlining thing very fast because I do want to, with a couple of minutes left, I do want to get into the, what I'm saying about this, that basically that the picture here is that the redlining itself created the mosaic or the map that I showed you, whereas right now it defines and can very much explain where folks of color live today. And when you think about those neighborhoods where folks of color live today, what you're starting to see is a number of these other trends. And I'm going to go back and say that a lot of this has to do and is very directly connected to the historic housing practices and policies in the city. I use volatility as the metric because I think there's a number of ways to think about this and to categorize it. I think evictions are definitely a way to think about. I think Matt Desmond's work is profound. I think people should really get a hold of that and to understand how evictions are used as a tool to destabilize. They are a way, but there are other ways that people can get displaced. And some of them are in the same vein as evictions, so non-renewal. So in essence, in Madison, you can non-renew somebody for no reason as long as you don't do it for any reason kind of thing. So after you don't have to renew them on their lease. But another way that people are displaced, I went back into, this gets into the weeds about the type of housing, but in a lot of these, the way that low-income housing is funded, in order to make it and to keep it low income through acquisition and the development process, it uses subsidies through different programs that are administered by HUD but are defined by the IRS. Now, what that means is it becomes income restrictive housing. And so when you have housing that is income restricted at 30 or 50%, again, your lowest income housing, you have, again, this is a concept that is, I think folks who are in social service, social work, housing understand it. Other folks, I'm going to try and get us through. It's called the cliff effect. And what it means is when someone is receiving benefits from the state, when they get to a certain, if they go over their income threshold, they lose those benefits, but the gap that they would have to make up is rarely covered by that increase in wage. So if you're going to go from $12 an hour and then you are covered by the benefits and you're able to live in the housing, if you go from 12 to, you know, unless you can go from 12 to 22, you are not going to be able to cover the difference in what it would cost you to have the same benefits as it pertains to insurance, childcare, all these other things. And so what that does, and let's just say that we are, you know, you work with somebody's in housing, they do, you know, they're out here, they get that promotion. Let's say they can. One of the other effects that, one of the other parts of the cliff effect is that it can affect your housing. So all of a sudden, you get that job. Now you can no longer live in the same neighborhood. And because, again, this gets into Madison, again, is not the only place that you see this, but in some of these a lot of these neighborhoods, what you see is there's very low income housing and very expensive housing and nothing in the middle. So you can't go from low income housing into something in between low income housing and very expensive single family, detached single family, you know, there's nothing in between there. And so you have to move, in some cases, completely out of the city before you can find housing that's comparable to what you were living in, which again amounts to a type of volatility.
Yeah, if I could just interject with a similar example, a neighbor of mine, for example, you know, she works, she's in income restricted housing, and she wants to further her education, but she can only take one course. She wants to do 2 or 3 courses so she can complete her degree to be an educator. But if she takes an additional course, then she's past this threshold or these requirements that she is not, you know, receiving other income or benefits. So she's repressed from furthering her academic career and eventually, you know, her income over time, as long as she stays in this particular building. So not quite the same, but the effect is somewhat similar.
Absolutely. So absolutely, that's exactly, you know, again, it's the same concept, right? So we get this thing about the housing. One of the things that I started getting into and how this affects, and one of the challenges that we have in Madison, again, this is going to be a Madison thing, but it, I think that it is applicable in terms of volatility everywhere. But one of the things in terms of local political functions, and so previous slide, and again, I'm kind of jumping through this to get through it. I'm realizing this is taking a little bit. But one of the things that we're talking about is when we say it compromises somebody in terms of going to school or in terms of educational attainment. So when you're moving schools all the time, there's a lot of research that is in the academic version of this that I cite about how volatility in housing tenure, it affects academic performance of children, and the younger they are, the harder it is on them. So if you have a situation that by policy, again, we're talking about a historic process. So you have historic processes that created the landscape in which this housing environment exists. Now, in that environment, you have certain types of housing that are created, and within this housing, the policies are conducive to extreme volatility. What I'm saying that's doing is, again, it's not in, this is why these things are very hard to put your finger on, because it's not like there is a sinister cabal of people who are sitting around saying we're not going to educate these children in the same way that we're going to educate, you know, we're going to do this in a way that's unfair. It's saying that these historic practices mean that children are compromised in terms of their access to democratic processes and institutions, in this case, schools. Now, another thing that I talked about and that I get into is electoral processes. And what this does, if you wanted to be politically active in let's say you wanted to run for city council, or you wanted to, you know, organize around these type of things, what does it do there? I don't know why this slide got missed. Excuse me, like I was down all week. This is the school district. This was supposed to be a couple things above. I don't know how well you can see this, but something I show with this, let me see if I can zoom in on this thing, because there is some stuff here that oh, it's too much. I do want to show, there's some, let's see here. That didn't work. There's a school district. There's a school here called Stevens Elementary School. It's right here, right? This is Stevens. You guys see this? Now, this is Stevens Elementary School. This is Stevens Elementary School. This is Stevens Elementary School. And this is Stevens Elementary School. So that's how this school district, and there's a number of them in Madison that are like this, that are broken down almost deliberately to avoid certain areas. And so when you think about where if I told you, and this is a true story, that Stevens Elementary School feeds into, a part of Stevens feeds into Senate, which is over here. So again, I'm sorry, this is it's supposed to be a couple slides up ahead before this, so it kind of jumps around. But the reason I show this is because the way Allied Drive, which is another one of the neighborhoods that the children in Allied Drive, they go to 3 different schools. There is no school in Allied Drive. So where you have these concentrations of very low income housing, there are no schools. When I worked in Oakland in a school, it was 99.9% extreme poverty. We could walk to every school, every house, every student's house from the school, because it was all around the school. Now, even those extreme poverty, the children, you know, we worked with the older brother, we worked with the younger, you know, we worked with families, and you could work with families. And so, again, nowhere is unique in the United States. There is no place that's unique or immune to the disparities that are the residuals or history of racism in the United States. But there's these things that affect different places differently. There's this Brentwood Elementary School. Brentwood neighborhood is here. The children, now there are 1, 2, 3, 4 elementary schools right there, right? 4 elementary schools right there. The children from Brentwood, right here, sorry, this thing right here, go to Emerson, which is right here. So they bus them. When you look at where your high schools are, there is no low-income neighborhoods around any of the high schools, and on and on and on and on. And so the type of thing about having community association with places that our children are going to school, or that we go to school as children, is completely non-existent for the majority of the folks of color in Madison, Wisconsin. Again, this is just another example of the way that this is working. So I apologize about this, the way that that slide was there. But the localized political functions, and I'm going to go into this. So what I'm saying is that because of the places that people are living, again, going to this, which is a residual of the history of land use policies in the city, because of the places that they live, it affects their, first of all, it's moderator from volatility, which is mobility, but also affects the way that they are able to access democratic processes and institutions, one of which was schools, and I talked about that at length. The next one I want to talk about, and I kind of brought up, was this idea of civic engagement and civic involvement. As Sherilyn said at the outset, I was on the task force of government structure, which, without knowing what that is, it's kind of hard to, basically Madison, I'm going to show you guys another map, and I want to show you guys something. Shows up. It's not in this. All right, let's see here. So you guys can see this map with all these colors. What this is, and I just chaired the redistricting committee. So the aldermanic districts look a little bit different now. But what this is showing is the aldermanic districts, the city council districts for Madison. Now, something that if you're not from Madison, what you will notice about Madison, Madison has 20 city council members. Atlanta has 16. San Diego has 8. This is an inordinate, it's extraordinarily large. And what I argue is that Madison has something of an aldermanic gerrymandering, in that there's no political constituency of color in any aldermanic district, or no significant political constituency of color in any aldermanic district. Part of it is because the districts are so small. Madison has 104 boards, commissions, and committees. New York City, I think, has 90. So if you think about, so the argument is that it creates representation. What I actually found when we did this, as Sherilyn mentioned when we got going, I was on this task force that looked at this. But when you look at these same neighborhoods, again, excuse me, these little areas that are in blue, you see that they're broken up. And so in any of these places where you might have constituency, again, these are the places where folks of color live. When you think about the regions where we have concentrations of folks of color, they're broken up into many, many aldermanic districts, which means that political organizing is essentially impossible for communities of color. When you looked at this historically, what you found, and this is on another map, this is the boards, commissions, and committees map. What this shows is that in terms of the people who are represented on the boards, commissions, and committees officially designated by the city of Madison, there are 4 geographic areas that are overwhelmingly represented, none of which are in the neighborhoods that are, again, where we have concentrations of folks of color. Now, so that means in essence, you have 4 neighborhoods who make the decisions for all of the city in terms of transit, in terms of land use, in terms of parks, in terms of every part, community development, all these things. Now, when I talked about the volatility, I'm gonna go back to this, about 50% turnover, is that if you move, you can't be an alder. And so you have this thing where, and I know I can't highlight this one, but again, we're looking at this Brentwood neighborhood, which is this neighborhood up here in this 12 in the big yellow, that's Brentwood. If I move across the park into what's called Woodland Park Apartments, I can't be an alder. And if I move, and we're talking about a mile, if you move there down the street, the point is the volatility alone compromises people's ability to participate in democratic processes. And this, so I was on the, talked about the ERO, which is the Education Resource Officer Committee. I was on there for the school district, and at the root cause, and why I bring this back to housing is because we're talking about police in schools, right? Which is a thing all over the United States. It's a contentious issue. What we found is that a lot of the things that are, why the school district felt and the police department felt like we needed police in our schools, the root cause of so many of them actually had to do with housing. So again, you have this other politically contentious issue that at the root of it is housing. And you're thinking about this in terms of the history of housing practices, and this is where we are dealing with this other thing. I'm gonna go through this.
Justice, could you elaborate a little bit more on the connection between housing vitality and resource officers in the schools? I don't quite get it.
Yeah, no, I know, because I ran through that. So what we found, as a Marine veteran, now not every city in the United States has police in their schools.
Mm-hmm.
More and more do, especially actually since Columbine is when we started seeing an increase. But something that I did, I'd worked in schools around the country, and in the places that I had worked, we did not have police in our schools. Even in Oakland, where there are police, there is, ERO, there are EROs or SROs. Where I was at in Oakland, the police didn't enter, they weren't like patrolling the schools, they were outside the schools, because the argument was you need to make them protect them, from external threats. My belief, my fundamental belief going into it, and I believe that when you're going to do work like this, you should lay your biases out at the beginning, and then you should let the chips fall where they may, and you should be open-minded and let the process of academic integrity or research integrity guide you so that you're not going in there trying to, confirmation bias. As the Marine, I don't understand why we need the capacity to kill children in the places that we're educating them, but that's my belief. And so I went in kind of with this question as to what is going on here where we need police in our schools, right? You need this armed sentry patrolling the hallways. Going back to what I was saying at the top of this presentation is that a lot of the disparities, so you talk about arrest rates, this was the thing, is that we saw in Madison, like a lot of places, that when children are arrested, there's disproportionate treatment and punishment and excuse me, adjudication for children of color versus white children for the same thing, right? And so, one of the things with the police and school argument was that. So when we started doing this and we went deep into this and we walked the schools, we were in the schools, we spent a couple of years looking at this. A lot of the things that the police themselves and the school staff felt the police were necessary to address were residuals of things that were happening in the community. And a lot of those things are what I'm saying are actually more connected to housing than what was going on inside the schools. So this is just a quote from this. And a lot of the things, in terms of root cause analysis as to what was actually happening that, made folks feel, ultimately the police were, in essence, they were semiotic. They were a symbolic representation of feelings of safety. People didn't feel safe one way or the other. And teachers didn't, students didn't, the police didn't make people feel more safe necessarily either. And, but the question was like, well, what's happening? Why is it that we're having these situations? Why are folks not connected to their schools? Going back to that map I showed, why are what is going on here? Where what are the root causes of a lot of the behavior? And a lot of the things that we saw in terms of the root cause, and again, this gets, I don't like root cause because it implies a singular ambit from which things grow. There were many, many factors that we saw contributing to, and for the folks who are in social sciences, there were many factors that contribute to delinquency, and there are many factors of, in terms of aggression, in terms of children, children being in pain, children not being connected to academic spaces. There's all these things that kind of contributed to it. But I think very few of them originated in the school. A lot of them originated outside the school. And again, because it isn't in your neighborhood, or you don't have any connection to it, I don't think that it gives license to be destructive or violent or aggressive. But I do think if you think your mother or your grandmother or your uncle or your aunt or your neighbor who you see all the time is going to see you being a knucklehead in the street, you know what I'm saying? I do think that in general, for healthy children, regardless of income status, it does add a layer of authority that's a latent authority that we have, that, we are going to respond to that. Whereas if you're in a place that, and there's a lot of this research comes from and the busing conversations that have happened all over the place, and that have been prevalent. Boston has a pernicious and horrible history of busing. They have a lot of data on this too, but the idea of being connected to educational spaces, I think, is very important for children, when they're in these spaces. So again, I kind of want to get into the mitigation stuff. I think one of the things with the task force on government structure is that we found that the way that Madison's government, and part of the challenge, why is it that this stuff persists? Why is it that we can't change it? And a lot of the challenge that Madison has, we found, this is a task force, we spent 2 years on this, and I don't know, man, hundreds of hours on this thing, but, over 90 meetings, every type of survey, community outreach effort we could have done over that 2 years. A lot of this is that the way that this whole thing was structured fundamentally made it challenging to actually make a difference in terms of policy. And the council does not have the, let's say, teeth or the weight, and they definitely don't have the longevity to be able to go in and actually make a lot of these changes. So housing and development, land use, these things take decades to, when you have a project that take, these issues that we're dealing with, the disparities, they've taken decades. Mitigation is also going to take many, many years to do it. And if you have the council changing over all the time, and it's, the council changes over every 2 years. Our school board is effectively the same thing. When I was on that task force to look at the EROs, the school board couldn't even get the district that it was in charge of to give it data. They couldn't get them to show up to a meeting, and they worked for them ostensibly. But like I said, the way that this thing is operating here is that neither of these bodies of government can fundamentally do anything about the practices of the government that they are responsible for. And we saw that loud and clear with the structure of the city government. And so the entities that are responsible for mitigating a lot of these issues are they're ill-equipped to actually do anything about it, even though many of the people on them, I mean, I think housing in every race around the United States for municipal councils, housing is one of the platform issues almost everywhere. And, you know, again, this is a Madison thing, specifically about Madison. It's a story about why in a place that has these historic disparities, this pernicious history of redlining and restrictive covenants, land use practices, where you have so many people that are sympathetic to that reality and want to do something about it. Why is it that it not only persists, but why does it actually get worse? And a lot of what I am suggesting is that this has to do with the structure of the government. All right, so you can read this. I know there was a lot, and it was a little bit longer than I think I initially intended. But this is patterns. The history of housing policy contributes in a very significant way to housing volatility in the ways that I described volatility today. The impediments that are created by that in terms of accessing democratic process institutions is detrimental to collective efficacy. And so what I'm saying is that because of housing, if we don't have the ability to access all of the vehicles, democratic institutions, meaning our school system, meaning electoral politics, meaning these other things, because of the history of it, it's very challenging for us to get the collective ability to do anything about it. And the structure of our local government makes it very difficult for long-term mitigation strategies. And this is a lot of why, even in a place that is generally seen as being progressive, these places not only exist, but are of the worst in the United States. All right, that was a lot. Again, you know, we're talking a few hundred pages, and I'm sorry about that slide. Like I said, it's been a rough week just because I was knocked out. I guess.
That's great. That's great. Okay, what we're going to do, friends, yeah, that is a lot, you know, and I was on the dissertation track. I didn't make it as far as you've done, Justice, but I really appreciate, you know, how difficult it is to take so much research and try to, you know, narrow it down and, you know, make it accessible to folks outside of academia. It is a real challenge. And I know we have a couple of dissertators, doctorates in the room, you know, and others who have been on that journey to some extent or another who really appreciate, you know, the challenges and how successfully, you know, you've met that tonight. So what we're going to do, friends, is just take a very short 5-minute break, give Justice a chance to really get some of that water down, maybe get a good cough out of himself. You can go off screen if you want. We'll have some music playing in the background for a few minutes. And meanwhile, think about, you know, the questions and comments, you know, that this is raised for you. I know I've got a couple. And, you know, because it's really shed some light for me on some of the obstacles that we run into in trying to serve families in our neighborhoods. You know, and things of that nature, and what can be done. What can be done? I think is probably one of the bigger questions as well. So, Nason, Jillian, get a little music, and we'll all come back in 4 or 5 minutes. Oh, all right. Well, thank you, Justice. Let's see, and if you're back, if you could turn on your cameras, great. So we know you're in the room. Awesome. Hey, Rebecca, how you doing? Hey, Scott Martin from Platteville, glad you made it. Welcome, Sonia. Oh, Sonia's here. Is that a relative? Is that your wife, Justice?
No, it's my little sister, actually. She's in LA.
Your little sister. Oh, cool. Wonderful. Welcome, Sonia. How are you? That's awesome. Hey, oh my God, you're so beautiful. You're here to support your big brother. That's fantastic.
It's
Welcome.
a very
welcome.
important conversation, so I'm really happy to be here. It's a lot
Oh,
of information.
We're delighted to have you. Are you in Madison also, or where are you?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Okay, great. Yeah, there's a lot of commonalities here. We've got some folks from California. I used to live in California. My sister who's here, she's a graduate from Stanford too, Justice. For her undergrad, there's just all kinds of connections, in the room. So this is really, really great. Rebecca's from California. Awesome. All right. So yes. So we're like the center of the center of the continent, or North America. Anyway, I have to remember there's some Canadians here too. So and my sister's one of them. Yeah, you are. Not originally, but yeah, for a long time now. Okay, folks. So first, even though I said I had a couple of questions, we'd like to hear from you first. And I want to invite the folks on their phones, if they have a question or a comment that they'd like to share, please unmute yourself and tell us your name and just where you're from. And let's hear what your thoughts are. And if you don't have to say anything, we'll just be quiet for a minute or two and to give you a chance to come off mute and engage. And if not, then we'll move on, because I know you can't use the chat. Okay. Going. We can always come back, but gone. All right. So anyone else, if you have a question or a comment, you can either put in the chat, we'll read it if you care not to speak yourself, or raise the participant hand, and so you can get in the queue with your questions or thoughts, comments on the presentation, anything you'd like Justice to go into a little bit deeper. And here are some things you can think about. Many of us are involved, in community work. So how is what you've heard tonight help your understanding of the challenges that you face or seeing your community face in trying to do work in neighborhoods? Does this inform that in any way for you? Regina?
Yeah, I have a question. The last time you presented, Justice, you told that story about, well, let me first just say that sometimes we look at these things just as a single fact. This is what happens. There's redlining. There's all of this kind of thing. And, you shared some of the implications of that that have more to do than just about the fact that there's redlining. And I remember the story you told about the relationship between that and where kids, where young kids needed to do, and the theft of automobiles that were being stolen. And, there was this epidemic of stolen automobiles, and then you described the reason, what actually was happening. And I wonder if you had any more stories similar to that, where we can make some more of those connections.
Yeah, and please even retell that one. Not everyone knows that story.
Yeah, so the story, it's funny because I, as you could imagine, what I did was, so you saw at the very end, just to get through it, there's the health stuff, and then there's the crime thing. There was just those little mods, those little avatars, and but there's a whole. I could do the same thing with the crime. There's a number of them. So the story is this: that in Madison, right now, one of the things that is a challenge for the city is that there's a lot of children who are stealing automobiles. But something that's not unique, something about these thefts is that Madison doesn't have a shopping culture, meaning they're not in San Diego. If your car gets stolen, they're going to shoot that thing across. A lot of times you can take it to a bigger place and get it chopped, or you can take it across the border. You can do this. But what's happening is there's a joyriding thing that's happening here. I agreed to do something, create as part of Commonwealth, we do something called the Youth Advisory Board. We have a bunch of kids who we pay to provide critique and commentary to the chief of police. They asked us if I would facilitate this. It's been really interesting. It's been a lot of very raw conversations. I'm actually really, I should say, very impressed with the chief that he's stuck with it and he's stayed true to his word about allowing them a forum. So one of the things that are the kids who are stealing these cars are young kids. In many cases, middle school. We're seeing, so they're overwhelmingly represented by children who are under 16. And again, they're not shopping them. They're not trying to sell them. What they're doing is they're joyriding and they're leaving them. And so they're finding, the kids will steal a car, go to McDonald's, go to the mall, drive around, and in many cases, getting these very high speed, very dangerous things. Now, I actually, when the kids, when the police was talking to, when the chief was talking to them, they brought up the fact that transit, again, the transit thing, it's another map, it's another part of this, but in those neighborhoods where transit works really well in Madison is on the Isthmus, the downtown area. It is horrible in, I'm gonna do this again real quick. So we're looking at this, right? So, say this, to get, sorry, I'm doing this fast. To get from, okay, on the north side here, right? To get from right there, Madison is not a big city. To get from right there, cross town, right? Right there to right here, on public transit in Madison, Wisconsin, takes 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours. Now you could drive to Milwaukee, eat lunch, and drive back in that same amount of time. You could drive to Chicago in the time it takes to take public transit. The neighborhoods at the periphery have the worst transit access in the city. Now, what I did, once the kids started saying that the transit in their neighborhood sucks to the police, I, pulled out, I looked at this. I don't have it up right now. I could probably look and try and find it. But so what I showed the chief is that where the cars are getting stolen are in the neighborhoods, the areas that have the worst transit in the city. Now, I don't think that is a reason to steal a car. And I'm not saying that that's okay. But if I were looking at this, so another example are DUIs. So a DUI is a function of drinking and driving and distance, if you will. If you looked at at random, pulled a random person of color out of Madison and you looked at where they live, the odds are they are going to live in, again, where we are overwhelmingly represented is at these peripheralized neighborhoods. To say that the story, it's so hard when you're not from here to get this, because even in like every place I've ever lived, where there are neighborhoods and areas, communities of color, Roxbury, I think Dorchester, I'm thinking Oakland, like there is economy in those places, right? When I say peripheralized, I mean peripheralized. There are establishments, there are restaurants, even if they're low income. There are no establishments, there is no economy in these. I don't call them neighborhoods, right? These are enclaves. They are peripheralized pockets of housing. That's what they are. they're not, because there is no economy to speak of in any of these places. The economy is in the downtown area, the place where, and this is what I said at the beginning about proximity to economy, is that there is no economy out there. And so in order to go, now I'm not saying drinking is good or bad. I do know that people do drink, and it is a thing culturally to maybe go out after work and maybe have a drink and go home, or maybe you want to go on a date and you and your date are going to go out to dinner and maybe you're going to have a drink at dinner. Now, if you grab a random person of color in Madison, Wisconsin, and you find and you say they went to a place to have a drink, the odds are they're going to have to drive up to 3 times as far as a white person. Now, the bus in Madison, when you go up here, because it's so bad, see, when you're not from here, it's hard to say this to someone who lives in an area that has functioning transit, because in many, like in San Francisco, Oakland, definitely in Boston, everyone rides the bus because it's the best way to get anywhere, and you can get all over the place. New York City, forget it. People, I have friends that still don't, 40 years old, don't have a license. Because why? You can take transit everywhere, right? In Madison, if you grew up here and you ride the bus, it's because you did something wrong. Like you made a mistake. You know what I'm saying? Like something didn't go right, and so therefore you have to ride the bus. It is a pejorative. It's not something that you did because there is no, unless you live in that downtown area where the transit is great. If you live down there, ride the bus. It's great. Get back and forth. I used to use it before the pandemic. I would jump on the bus to go to meetings. I worked, like I showed you guys, I worked down here in the Isthmus when the city council building, the city county building, when there's meetings with the city government, I would jump on the bus because it's quick. It's quick, it's cheaper than parking, it makes all the sense. Mm-hmm. You don't. So those are 2 examples. I mean, those are other examples. So that's what Regina was saying. But yeah, that's the, and on and on.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Rudy, because that had a lot of impact for me, when I heard that in your first presentation, Justice, and it just really made the connection very poignant. My daughter, when she was here and just out of high school, and those of you that know Madison, we weren't in the Isthmus, but just slightly outside of it, but not in these peripheral neighborhoods, right near Science Drive and Mineral Point Road. But she needed to take the bus to go to work at the mall. And the mall wasn't that far away. I could get to the mall driving in 5 or 10 minutes, but her bus trip was an hour and a half. To just to give you an idea, of how, just how insane, it really is. So thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. And these kids, as you said before, Justin, they're picking up these cars because they want to take their girlfriend out on a date and there's no place local that they can go to. So they have to go across town, and, it's just, yeah. Okay. Any other questions or comments just yet? We're a small group. We can talk a lot. This doesn't usually happen. Rennie and Dave, who's talking tonight? Or both of you talking tonight?
Well, Dave, as usual. Justice, your talk is just so loaded, and it's such an important topic. If you could just talk a little bit specifically, as if there were people who did not know what redlining is and how in the world it got started. Because to me, Rennie and I have been doing so much reading, and particularly this wonderful book called The Color of Law, which explains redlining and many other phenomena. But if you just speak on the idea that this has all been designed to protect the poor white homeowner from the threat of these dangerous people, supposedly. And it skewed the whole idea of a nation taking care of its citizens.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a good explanation. No, it is. I mean, it's no more. I always, in terms of the thinking, it is no more than, again, historic fear rooted in racism, and that's where that was there. The theoretic, depending on how you approach it, I tend to be post-structuralist in terms of the way that I frame myself theoretically, which I don't know, it's more of a derivative of Weberian thinking probably than Marx, but I would say that a Marxist analysis of race would probably incorporate race. In essence, was a construct that was created to I mean, it was an economic concept, right? Like, it's a way to subordinate people so that you could, in essence, exclude them from economic processes, right? So you could say that they didn't deserve, everything, they deserve less for the same amount, right? It's a labor thing. So for the labor, they should not be compensated in terms of capital gain. So, this was the same thing. And every part of it, in terms of redlining, functioned that way. When we talk about proximity to economy, and again, it is as much about protecting folks from the other as it also is about protecting access. So there's another part of a different kind of thread in the dissertation. Idea of home ownership. I mean, home ownership alone is not what built wealth. It was the exclusionary aspects of home ownership that was the vehicle through which the racist practices gave exclusive access to economy to populations. That's what gave them wealth, right? Home ownership was just that vehicle. So, because a lot of now there's this, I think there's, you'll hear it where they're like, hey, we got to get more Black and brown folks into home ownership situations because that's how you build wealth. Well, I mean, I think if you think about it in terms of stability of housing tenure, sure, that makes sense. In Madison, like a lot of places right now, houses are selling for about $100,000 over their assessed value. And they're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% of that being kind of what the contingency used to be, saying, hey, you know what, if I buy a house, I'm going to take that off because it needs a new roof. So I'm going to take $15,000 off. Now you're saying that it's going up, whatever that is, about 50% more in terms of the work that's needed. And they're still tacking that on there. And an important thing is that when you buy a house, unless you pay cash, you didn't buy a house. The bank bought the house. What you did is bought the debt. And the way that this is working in terms of how people are getting into these situations where we're getting more and more, I mean, it's not the same. This is a different conversation. It's not the same as what happened in the aughts. And there's some unique differences. But right now, this has all the makings of a bubble. A lot of the same practices are coming back. But this home ownership concept, again, it wasn't home ownership by itself. It wasn't just the fact of getting someone into a 30-year or, getting them into a mortgage where they had purview over their housing situation. It was about the exclusionary access that it gave them into these other things. And so, what you guys said, I think, with that, I would totally agree with you.
Thank you. Dave. Hi, Dave.
Good evening. You mentioned a little bit about what is to be done. And the temptation is to look at all the factors and to try to take them out one by one, which is, you pointed out, really, really difficult. But when you read stories of individuals who have come out of these situations, it seems to take, at least for the ones who, a lot of the ones who do, maybe only 1 or 2 generations. So it seems like a more productive approach might be to examine the success stories and find out what made them successful and to promote those particular factors among the people who need the remedy. Am I making sense, or am I just
No, I think it's an issue.
Psychobabble?
No. I mean, I won't, I think just as an analytic tool, right? Like whenever you say, look, a lot of people are struggling. You got so-and-so that isn't. Let's look at so-and-so and say, well, what's going on with them that is different or unique? Yeah. And then let's figure that out, and then let's scale that, right? Let's scale that, because obviously it isn't impossible. And, I would never say that anything is impossible. And so made it, so why can't everyone? I mean, I call it the Oprah effect, right? I mean, Oprah, so how come everyone's not Oprah? Couldn't everyone just be Oprah? I mean, everyone could just come out of this, and then, and what I would say is there are some things that I think it's definitely applicable to, right? And I think, but when you start looking at what those factors are, that's where the scalability. So you say, well, when the things have to do with parental anything, right? A child doesn't have a choice as to their parental anything. So I could lament about the parents forever. It doesn't change the future of the child. And you could say, well, I think another part of so much of this, and I would include my story in this, is luck. And I don't know how to scale luck. And I think if what we're trying to do as a policy is to scale good fortune, I don't know how to do that in terms of a policy solution, whereas stabilizing housing, doing things to create soft income by energy efficiency, doing things in terms of changing priorities in transit, doing things in terms of restructuring the way that we think about our common council, those are all things that I can understand in terms of policy solutions. But if I were just to say, well, I could go through so many points in my life. Some of it had to do with choice. And a lot of times when I think about the moments of choice, where I had to make a choice and I made one versus the other, I would say that probably 60% was probably luck, and 40% probably had to do with rationale that had been instilled, or something that I had been taught, or someplace that I had learned something. And what I call a lot of that, I know people don't like the term privilege. My take on privilege is this. I think everyone has a poem and everybody has a price. And the trick and the treasure is to find the humility to be honest about both. And I say that just to say that I have a lot of privilege. My grandmother, my grandfather was a migrant worker. My grandmother was of the first Mexican, or she would never call herself a Chicana, but she's of the first Chicanos who were Mexican Americans born in the state of Wisconsin on record in Racine. They had 9, farm worker, 9 children. My grandmother has a master's degree in education. every one of her 9 kids stepped foot on the college campus. Not all of them finished. My father's probably the outcast of the family. For all intents and purposes, you know, my uncle, a Black man who, you know, married, you know, to a Mexican woman, he has a PhD. My cousin, you know, my dad's first cousin, you know, my uncle, if you will, my cousin is a judge. She also has a PhD. I mean, my father was a musician in Madison, but he was also connected to a lot of the student activist groups at the university. All that is extreme privilege, right? Like that's all, and it's extraordinary. And I don't, you know, like I always call it my Mexican privilege, right? Like I have extreme Mexican privilege. I don't know, you know what I'm saying? Like I had these folks, now how do you scale privilege? How do I scale that privilege, right? How do I scale that? How do I say as a policy, what we have to do is make sure that all other Chicano or Mexican men, their grandmother also needs to have a master's degree. You know, I can't, right? Like in all that, even all that to say, a lot of the decisions that I made as a child, again, I was locked up a lot of my childhood, even with all of that, you know, my dad, again, is an outlier. So even with all that, I still had to, you know, there was still a number of moments in terms, I have this whole narrative I can do about all these moments of luck. I barely got into the military. I got in the military by the skin of my teeth in September. I had to sit there and, you know, interview with them for 3 days in Milwaukee, basically begging to get in. I got in on what's called a September recruit, which October is the fiscal year for the military. So at the end of the year, there's, you know, we got this person over, you know, and then I was there and they said, hey, you know, and I got in because of all of my background. I couldn't get a clearance, a security clearance to do a number of things. So for the first 3 years, I had to take basically an administrative personnel job in the military. So what did that mean? That meant that I had a job that I could go to school at night. Now, if I would have been able to get into my first couple choices, a good buddy of mine who had a you know, white guy who had a better, you know, in terms of a better go of it as a kid, he got his clearance. He ended up as a combat engineer. Those guys didn't have, you know, infantry guys as a private, you don't have no time after work to go to anything, you know, so I was able to go to school while I was in the military. Now, Dave, your point, I made the choice to go to school, you know, and that's something in me, again, going back to that. I guess all this to say, I could keep going. I mean, when I was in Iraq, I was hit with a mortar. A guy that was 15 yards away from me blew up, and I didn't blow up. And, you know, I came back from a war with all limbs intact. You know, I don't know, you know, I deal with my own demons. But there's a number of these things that I don't know how to scale, right? Privilege and luck are very difficult to scale. Other things in terms of the infrastructure and the political environment that we live in are easier for us to tackle as policymakers. So I never ever dismiss personal accountability. I never ever dismiss the idea of drive. You know, it's not like I just somehow am like some, you know, sea turtle on some, I'm thinking about Finding Nemo, you know, on some ocean current that I just kind of was like, whoa, and then just ended up. I had to make a lot of decisions. I mean, I'm in graduate school now. I run this organization. I've made these decisions to do these things. I think a lot of, you know, with a mixture of all these things. So I think to Dave, just to answer that question, I think we should look at these things and we should decipher which parts of these stories are the things that are scalable, like the policy components, and which are the parts that are maybe a little bit harder, which parts are privilege and luck, and which parts are actually tangible things that we can get our hands around. But I I will, the people, the grit, the guts, the people who went out there in spite of everything. And I don't, I work with children, I hope audaciously. I work with kids, children of the darkest dimensions of the human experience. And there's not a day that goes by where I'm ever telling them, well, this whole system is insurmountable and sucks to be you, and I don't know what you're going to do, like never, right? You're going to have to wake up every day, and it's going to get rougher every day. It's not going to get any easier. And so take 5 minutes, think about that, and then it's time to go to work, and we're going to have to work on this stuff. But I think it's a really good question. I don't know, Dave, did that answer your question, at least in terms of my perspective?
Well, partly, but I can tell by your reply that I would classify your reply as very biased, in that it doesn't sound like you particularly are inclined to go in that direction. Now, I also so one of the things that I think of is that there is a fairly large anyway, that seems to be, number of middle-class people who have arisen from poverty for various reasons. So there have to be reasons for that. Now, there's another aspect of this that I'm thinking of, and that is that there's a story that one of the counselors told to us here in Phoenix a couple of weeks ago. And I don't remember exactly where this happened, but it was in an area of the world which was a city, a large city, I think. And at the beginning, this very, very impoverished area was so bad that the Uber drivers wouldn't go there. And the law enforcement was having so many calls for this particular area that it was really a challenge to serve them in that way. So over a period of years, the Baha'i programs took hold, children's classes, junior youth groups, devotionals, study circles, the whole thing. And then the authorities started noticing something's changed. They're not getting these calls. And the Uber drivers are going in there with no issues. So they said, what's going on? So they asked the question, and of the local people who were local political people, and they said, ask the Baha'is. So they did, and they found the answer. It was these programs that were making the changes in people. And they were not just local changes, they were changes which propagated out to the greater community.
Yeah, I guess I understand what you're saying kind of as a rhetorical device. I don't know that I mean, everyone, when I worked, I did a project for the Obama administration. We became the My Brother's Keeper initiative. We looked at 434 programs in over 103 cities, lifting up exactly what you're saying. Well, what is the thing? I mean,
okay.
What are the things that are working? What is effective? How do these things work? What are the components of them? I will say that a lot of the, I totally believe in every, in terms of finding out what those things are, I think it's critical, right? Looking at what works, looking at what actually is effective. I would say that much in the way of the previous question about redlining, there are a number of stories in Tucson, Arizona. There was an ethnic studies program that was done for Mexican-American studies that was outlawed by the state of Arizona. Now that program, I would have called it, if I was them, I would have called it small R Republican education. And the reason is because it's taught a lot about self-determination, about culture, and those students started showing more progress in the subjects that were not covered than they did just in the subjects that were through that curriculum, and the state canceled it. Now, when funding decisions in terms of how you propagate and how you keep programs going, those are also very political. And so I would actually double down on your answer. And I would say, no, I think we have a lot of things in terms of what works and how it works. Everything from paying our educators more, providing living wages to a lot of the service sector economy where a lot of the parents live, providing sick leave, parental leave. A lot of these things are fundamentally effective, and we can actually make leaps and bounds. And I absolutely agree with you that if we look at things like what we found through PolicyLink during the My Brother's Keeper thing, where we lifted up what is actually working and actually supported those things, I am all in. I think that's exactly what we should be doing. And we should be prioritizing the things that do work and that are very effective. I couldn't agree with you any more at all with that line of thought.
Thank you both. That's a fascinating discussion. I want to add my 2 cents to this in 2 respects, and you all can make what you will of it. The very programs that David speaks of that were successful in this particular area and in many parts around the world, and mostly predominantly outside of the United States, in fact, there's been great success with these programs. But I think and this is my own personal experience, with doing children's classes, junior youth groups, for empowerment, these kinds of things. And these are very well-developed programs that were originally started in Columbia as literacy, and then evolved from there. And one of the difficulties that I'm aware of within communities is turnover. Because if the population is not stable, if the families are constantly moving, you can't gain any traction. The kids don't gain any traction. And that's often a difficulty that we find. I think it's been experienced here in Madison, in some of the higher turnover areas. That certainly was, and that certainly was the case in Southern Maryland when I lived there. And I think, so to me, I really, the concept of vitality, housing vitality, or stability or instability, I think it's very potent. It's very, very potent. So what can we do to help ensure that families can be housing stable? If you're trying to do a children's class or a junior youth group, and the kids are moving, every year or every 6 months outside of that neighborhood, what can you do? It doesn't matter how good your programming is. It doesn't matter. The other thing that I wanted to share, and then we're going to go to Sonia, who's been patiently waiting. Thank you, Sonia. The other thing that I wanted to share, and I'm not sure where this fits, but your question, Dave, and your response, Justice, made me think of this. And again, to me, it comes back to this example, I think, highlights the importance of what Justice talked about, economy, local economy. So if you think about places like Greenwood and Tulsa, the Black Wall Street of America, Rosewood, these are all places in post-Reconstruction US history that were phenomenally successful and rich. They had their own doctors, their own pharmacists, their own lawyers. And when I say these were segregated Black communities. They were incredibly successful. Now, of course, I'm not a proponent of segregation, but at the time, that condition provided for stability. So there wasn't this turnover. Now, what happened in those, so those are great examples of what worked. You know, clearly, these are very clear examples of what works. It doesn't matter how low your income is when you came into that community, you were able to prosper because those dollars were circulating within that community and reinforcing it and developing it. What happened with those communities is, I'm sure all of you know, but I'll say it just in case, is that each of those examples, and there were others, they were terrorized by white people who wanted what they had and took away everything they had and had built. And in Tulsa, they actually bombed it. They actually bombed Tulsa, bombed them, like you see these bombs in Ukraine. Of course, not on the same scale, but still a bomb coming down out of some guy's plane and burning up houses. You know, so think of those images we see in Ukraine right now. Put that to Tulsa for a minute. Mm-hmm. Put that to Tulsa for a minute, and the destruction of lives, of economies, everything. And then on top of that, and this is coming more back to redlining and other policies, the development of the transportation system in the US. So those communities of color that were prospering, and we have it right here in Madison as well. I forget the name of the neighborhood, Justice, but they built the freeways right through these places, right through these prosperous communities of color. So you lost your dentist, you lost your pharmacist, you lost your doctor, you lost the little, mom and pop store, gone. And so that sense of community, the physical or geopolitical structure for a community was dissipated. How do you come back from that? I mean, you got a freeway. Allied Drive is like that. There's literally a freeway. You know what the closest store is there? It's a Home Depot. And you're in an apartment and you really need Home Depot? Really? That's what's there, just to give you an idea. So I think both of those things, they just came to my mind, listening to the discussion, because I think that they all bring lessons to us. And thank you so much, Dave, for that stimulating question, and sharing that information. Sonia, thank you for waiting.
It's my pleasure. It's such a great discussion. I'm so happy to, I'm happy that you really brought up all of those specific situations, because they're important to remember that these policies do work. They work within communities that are functioning. And I think another thing about that is being able to truly invest, to feel safe enough in your place to invest in that space and to stay in that space and to invest in those schools and set up your shop in these neighborhoods. And I think that Madison has always struggled with making sure that our neighborhoods are neighborhoods for everybody. I grew up in Madison, and I know which neighborhoods were neighborhoods and which places were transient spaces. And if you lived in those spaces, you also knew that. You knew that nobody cared about you, and you had to go elsewhere for everything that you needed. But one of the questions that I am wondering if we have answers to this in Madison, or an idea of this, but like, what is the cost? What is it going to cost to invest in transit and to stick with it? Because it's not going to show us successes immediately. And we have to understand that in order to get those returns, we have to stay consistent with it. People have to be able to depend on these things, to use them and use them regularly. And then we will see down the line, but are we willing to invest that money, and are we willing to invest that time? And what does that even look like? And so, and I'm, transportation is one aspect, but we were talking about all of these things and where can we start? And so I was wondering, Justice, if you have an answer for that, but, or an idea of what that means. And then who we are taking, who we're asking for this money. I do know that people are not so willing to invest if we're not going to see immediate returns. And but how do we incentivize that? So those are my questions, my thoughts here.
Great, thank you, Justice.
So a couple of things with this investment. You know, in California, and you know, some of you guys might do this work in California. Maybe it's changed, but when I cut my teeth or started doing development work, it was in the state of California. Excuse me. You had to be making a political point not to maximize energy efficiency in every new building, because cost-wise, there were so many subsidies at the state level, and at the time under Obama, there was a lot of those were matched by the feds. And so when you did, you know, in terms of an individual proprietor or developer, and again, this is still in my for-profit world days, but the you maximized, right? You did everything. Low flow toilets, you did lighting, you definitely did photovoltaic everywhere you could, but you did all the things because it was the cheapest way to build. Wisconsin's not that way. And the argument for the state was that it's the best investment they can make for the long term because they know that the returns you get are going to take 10, 20, 30 years. And the way that we get construction loans, the way that we get funding for these things, they don't work on those scales in terms of temporal payback, right? And so the return on investment is greater, but it's over a longer period of time when you maximize energy efficiency, savings to consumer. We're seeing this now. Now, transit is one of these things that the state, you'll always lose money initially on transit, but what you're saving on is the externalities from not having good transit or people having access. That is, again, a political, Wisconsin, I use the energy thing first because it is the opposite here. I just built a building as a development company. We just built a building. I would give it maybe a C+, B- in terms of energy efficiency, and it kills me. But like, in order to keep it low income, there is no subsidy or an incentive to maximize energy efficiency in the state of Wisconsin. All of that is borne by the individual proprietor. And so when you create this is the thing you run into. Another thing, and again, it's not as simple as I'm about to make it seem. So I apologize. I don't mean, again, part of the thinking of post-structuralism, part of the problem that Marxists and even free market, and the free market structuralists is what I call them, but your free market conservative structuralists, your structural Marxists, they all have a problem with this because of the role that I take away from individual agency. So you see it on both ends, but I will say to the critique of Marxist thinking, I don't believe that there's a group or a cabal of people who are just trying to do anything, all things. I just don't know that it is that simple. However, there is a story, and the numbers may be off, but something that says, well, it costs $32,000 to incarcerate a child every year, where it only costs $12,000 to educate them. And I always tell people, but in a market economy, another way to say that is that you're making $32,000. There's $32,000 created by that child being incarcerated, and there's only 12 if that kid is educated. So that means that there is a lot of people who will lose. There is $20,000 that is lost in terms of how things right now. Now, whoever's losing that $20,000 is probably not neutral about it. Now, I'm not saying that whoever that is and whatever that is saying incarcerate children. I'm just saying they're lobbying hard to make sure that their industries continue, right? So the propagation of their industry is paramount to them as, you know, individual rational actors in the market. And so I always say that there are people who are fine with the way it is, that are just fine, you know, that are fine with it in terms of all things. And so I think a lot of the challenge, I mean, the Tavern League in Wisconsin, something, if you're not from Wisconsin and you want to know something about Wisconsin, we drink a lot of alcohol here in a way that is not, it's you know, like we don't notice the culture here, and it doesn't mean you have to drink here. And again, we have choices, and I get that. Now, in other states, the DUIs is a very serious thing, and the traffic fatalities in the state of Wisconsin is a very serious thing. Other states, you can buy booze at the store much later. You can buy booze in California, I think so. And when I was there, I feel like you could go in there at 2 in the morning and get booze. And again, I'm not supporting this. I'm just saying you can go to the store and get booze and bring it home later at night. The Tavern League in the state of Wisconsin has adamantly, vehemently opposed changing that law, because they want to make sure that people are going to the bars and not able to go and just get booze or get beer late at night. You know, even though in terms of the investment, in terms of what it's costing us as a society about having this bar culture and about having the DUIs in particular. So and again, I don't think that they're, you know, I don't believe in evil people per se. I think some people are in pain, some people are sick, and there's a few folks who have been educated in troubling ways, but I don't think that there are evil people trying to prevent good transit. I just think that they're, the way that we think about return on investment sometimes is a little skewed, if that answers your question.
Yeah. Chock full of information, Justice.
Well, I was saying, no, I'm just kidding. No, it's true. All of that stuff is very true. And it's all, but that is what I'm wondering for Madison, whose ear can we get into? Who wants these changes to happen? Who will benefit from it? Oh, sorry. Ruby has a lot to say.
I see.
But who wants to pay for this? And how do we make that a priority is what I'm wondering, if there's a way to do it. But I think there's so many things at play here. And I do think you answered my question, is that it's not an investment that is easy to make.
Yeah, I think there's the other question. Just to answer that real quick, I think one of the challenges, and part of what I brought up about electoral politics, is that a lot of people who have to gain, there is challenges in terms of accessing the municipal process. And so where transit works really well, when you look at in the 90s, the entire school board lived in one aldermanic district, one neighborhood. So, you know, when you think about where transit and all these things work really well, and you go back to that map about where there is representation on boards, commissions, and committees, it works very well in all the neighborhoods where you have everybody's on the commissions, boards, and committees. So I think that's part of the challenge. I do think that there is an effort here. We'll see. I don't know, you know, how well we'll do with it, but to try and change some of the aspects of the structure of government, change is really difficult, especially when so many people have either grown up in a system where it existed, you know, where something existed the way it did. So.
Thank you very much, Justice.
And I have maybe 10 more minutes, and then I'm going to have to retire.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I think this notion about, you know, the evil cabal versus, you know, the opposite, which, you know, I think you've really helped me appreciate even more, is what it means to be systemic, because it isn't some one person, you know, it isn't some one organization necessarily, it's a systemic thing. Racism is systemic, you know, and it's coming from so many different places in so many different ways. And there isn't just one person or one agency that you can go and say, hey, we need to fix this. because there's so much fundamentally, I think, in our society that has to be fixed. But let me not go on. Rennie and Dave. Is it Rennie this time or Dave again?
Yeah, it's
We're
the
good buddies
of the Daves. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
But Rennie and I lived in Germany for 5 years. That was back in the 70s. We could see the enormous influence of the public transportation that existed there. We knew families who had never owned a car. I mean, the well-to-do families who did not have a car. It was too much bother because they could take the streetcar and the train. They could get anywhere, and their children, 12-year-old children, would go to Belgium, to Luxembourg. They would go on very extensive trips because there were also youth hostels. And I think this is all historically, you have to trace this to FDR, to the enormous effort. We had wonderful train and trolley transportation, public transportation in this country at that time. And he launched many programs which were to buoy up the entire country. The CCC, the all these programs that were out there to help a nation that was impoverished, all over. Europe destroyed itself because of its terrible inequality, its terrible extremes of wealth and poverty. And they began to put their whole culture back together with these programs that FDR had promoted as their model. So they continued. Whereas in our country, here in America, there was a very strong pushback, which went under the guise of freedom, but it was freedom to keep your money, freedom to keep your big hunk of property. And it was a twisting of meaning. And that's when we lost our transportation system, because the car companies actually bought up public transit and then let it go to pot in order to promote their own, the image of the car as the model of freedom.
Thank you.
Especially the people who had all the, the unfortunate thing about many of those programs is that racism was built into them.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I'm thinking, I just watched something on YouTube. I love documentaries of all kinds, and it was about Henry Ford and, moving to mass production. And, he had some issues with that. And this is when one of the other motor companies was created. But he was also a very known racist. But you could see people tooling around, in their little cars under manifest destiny. Hey, I can go all across the desert, I'm free, I can go everywhere I want, right? So this sense of, independence, all kind of buys into a lot of the undergrid for our country. Rebecca, you're going to close us out, and I've got one closing question for Justice if he has time after you.
Thank you. Mine is just more of a comment and a piece of gratitude to Justice. I was not able to attend the whole meeting tonight because of extenuating circumstances, but I was at the first one. And you pointed out freeways and how they run through, and these large 4-lane, I don't even know what to call them, these almost, they're not freeways, they're laying in residential districts. I'm in Northern California, and you opened my eyes to things in Oakland, Albany, and all of that East Bay pieces. And it was kind of fascinating seeing how these structures have been overlaid over time, because then I started doing the research of when were these freeways built, when was that one improved, and realizing, and when you said the government, it's at the government level, when you start interfacing with these institutions to try and have a discussion or create change, it becomes so daunting for the individual. And I don't want to be like, you know, a downer on it, but it's like, God, there's got to be a way to have some sort of impact with these institutions without having it suck your entire life away, trying to chase all of the meetings and the hearings and the extensions and it's almost always money. And these people have lawyers who are paid to do nothing but keep track of all this stuff. And it's really challenging as an individual to do that. And I'd love to know, because you did say the change has to come with our governments. I would love to know, in your fantasy life, how would a government look? Would it be smaller? Would Madison be carved up into smaller pieces? Would it be, what would it look like?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rebecca. That was my closing question too. What's your dream list, Justice?
Well, these terms, small and big government, they evoke these other things. I think government, a representative democracy, is by the people, which means that people have equitable access to it. And I think having more people having access to this is very critical. You bring up the freeway thing is a whole another part of this. It has to do with the environmental thing, the 805 and 405.
Oh yeah.
In Oakland, you know, the deal is that exhaust is the type of metal, so there's these asthma rates, which my work at the medical school is looking at the way that, basically looking at how immunoregulatory function is affected by cortisol regulation, but asthma in terms of, here nor there, the bottom line is if you're not breathing, it compromises your ability to learn. So even, and this goes back to this point about individual choice, which is if you're growing up in a place that is poisonous, again, one of the things you see with a lot of outliers is that they're not growing up in a place that's poisonous, right? So if you're not poisoned, it makes it a lot easier to make those choices down the road. So I think, you know, these things about who and where, first and foremost, what is priority in terms of who influences and who has access to investment in government and the governance. I think my take is that it would be about representing the people for which it serves, and meaning all the people for which it serves, and that should be doing that. And when it's not, I think that we're having a lot of challenges. You know, we're all concurrently the 1% and the 99%. There is no easy way to break that down anymore because of consumption. The biggest firms in the United States are owned by millions of shareholders. So the tools of democratic action are in place. So why don't we use them? I said this, you know, this is during the Occupy stuff in 2011, you know, when there was a lot of these things. And I was like, well, I mean, organized labor controlled a third of the United States economy, you know, and I would say that if you own, you know, if you were holding $5.5 trillion of my money, I don't think I would protest your bank. I think I would just take my money out of your bank and that would be all. And then we would go about our way. But no one, the city of San Jose, there's a number of places that tried to do that actually, but you can't just take that type of money and invest it in, where do you put that money? You put it in your pillow? I mean, that's a lot of money, and these are people's pensions. And so rethinking the financial institutions, I think, is critical. I think we need to rethink how we're doing this. And I think there needs to be more regulatory oversight of our financial institutions, financial systems, so that the money that we invest sticks. Different day we can talk about, I mean, you know, there's a lot of hip bone connected to the leg bone here, but there's a lot of money. New York City has 1.4 million buildings that need to be retrofitted for energy by 2030 as part of Plan YC. They have about 4% of the workforce to do it. So you can't have a situation where you have all this work to be done and then have all these folks who need a job. You know, and so the type of investment in infrastructure, one of the things that is I think we were going the road of inflation for the past 3 presidencies, if you looked at our financial policy. But one of the things that happened during the previous administration with the pandemic is there was an infusion of capital without increasing supply and without increasing production. That inherently will lead to inflation. If you just flood with a bunch of money without, whereas in infrastructure, we have so much work to be done in the United States, on our roads, in our houses, in our, on our buildings, for energy, for all these things. I think we need to start with that. And that's a roundabout way to go at what I was just talking about with all these other things. But I think if we think that way about how are we investing and how are we making sure that capital that we make, I call this, again, this is wealth generation, right? This is democratic wealth generation that we need to promote and to be thinking about. And I didn't say anything about redistribution or anything else. I'm talking about generating wealth in areas, again, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I think we need to figure out, and we need to be very deliberate about pressing our governments, local, state, and federal, to allow us as Americans to do it. And I think that I would start there, right? That is the way that I would see this. I'm from Wisconsin through and through. I love the state. I'm a Marine veteran. I love this country. I would aspire, I believe, as much as it's a cliche, there's nothing wrong with this country that can't be fixed by what's right with it. I know if you know the source, I don't necessarily, he's not my favorite person, but I, leave it at that. But I just, I do believe that. And I do think that, I think we do need to, governments in terms of looking at what is working and what are those underpinnings, and then start scaling those things, as Dave brought up. I think we need to do that. I think that's exactly how we should be thinking about it. And we should be honest, about where we feel like the root of why we have such resistance to doing that. So that's how I would do it.
Thank you so much. Getting a lot of thumbs up over there. Well, I know we could go on longer because we do talk a lot, and usually the presentations are always great, but it's that after conversation, right? That's where it really gets deep. So thank you all for staying and participating in this. It's been very invigorating and stimulating, thought-provoking. Yeah, we have a lot of work to do. Well, we knew that coming in here. And I think everyone here is, undertaking some form of labor in helping us all create a more just and equitable society. So thank you, Justice. What's your timeline for finishing your dissertation? What's your committee pressing you to?
I need to be done by 24. I mean, I was supposed to be done initially last year. The pandemic, I do run a company, and it's been, for everybody. All of us have went through this. I mean, this is real. This thing that just happened, that is happening still. We all went through this. This is a thing, right? And so, managing staff, we also have, we operate housing. And so, the most common emergency maintenance call that we get, as you guys could probably imagine, folks that, understand, is toilets, and that was never the sexiest part of the job before the pandemic. It was less sexy during it. And so, in terms of, and I really, you guys, none of them are on here. You guys will never meet most of them, most likely, but the people that I work with are just phenomenal. And so I had to put all my attention on supporting our staff and our residents and the people that depend on us for the last 2 years. So I had asked my committee to give me a little bit of a sabbatical of my own, just to stop for a second and to focus on the company. And then, well, we're back at it, so we'll see. Hopefully.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you have an open invitation to come back whenever you would like to. I won't ask you to go on the calendar so you can stay focused and not add, you know, another distraction. But we're really grateful for you coming before and now. And, you know, I remember the first time you came, I think that same day, you had just come out of a meeting, or you were doing something with COVID and getting people, you know, set up for their vaccinations, you know, and then you ran to come here, you know, to do this. And I tell you, this guy, he's just amazing, you know, he just really, really is. So I really, truly thank you.
I'll just say to you guys, thank you so much that you guys invited me. I appreciate the invite, but also, hey, the work we're doing, the Marine in me, right, is, you know, it's sometimes you got to look at the big-ish sandwich and you got to take a bite. This is not for the faint of heart. These are very complex things that, you know, if there was an easy answer, someone would have figured it out. So I appreciate the fact that you guys have this space, that you guys come out and do this, that you guys are engaging this, that you guys are having the dialogues that you guys are having. This is really important work. And I feel better about the world that I live in because you guys are in it. So thank you so much for the invite.
Oh, that's so sweet of you. Thank you so much. Yeah, we're in it for the long haul. This is the long game. You know, we all know this is the long game. And again, we just appreciate you so much. And thanks for inviting your beautiful sister. I hope she'll come back. God, you got a gorgeous family. Those two cuties she has with her. Oh my gosh, they're so cute. What a lucky guy you are. But thank you for all your work you're doing in the community. And we really want to hear about Commonwealth development sometime, you know, more about what it does. And, you know, you're into so much. We just want to hear about everything you're doing. So you can just throw a dart as far as I'm concerned. Hey, I want to come talk about this. Like, okay, good. Let's find a date. You know, we can roll with that.
All right. Thank you for that.
All right. Well, thank you, friends. Everyone, have a great evening. See you in, 2 more weeks. Sorry, quick announcement. 2 more weeks. Randy Gottlieb, founder and CEO of Unity Works. She has her doctorate in education. She's authored 14 books, and she's going to talk about how to educate educators about racism. And of course, if you talk to anyone or you're ever seen with anyone, you are educating either by your actions or by your words. So it'll be relevant for everyone. So please come. You'll get the email announcement about it, you know, in a week or so. So awesome. So great to see you all. Welcome, Sonia. Welcome, Francis. The folks on the phone, Lorelei, thank you for being here, Scott, and the usual folks. And Dave, thank you. All right, friends. Joa, good night. Manoshare, everyone, we love you. Thank you for being with us. See you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.